You've made it back. Or perhaps you've drifted here half asleep, led by the sound of distant fifes, the soft whinny of horses, and the promise of a battle that mattered only briefly. Tonight, we're going to wander, not march, toward the hazy fields near a Belgian village called Ligny, a place known for barley, bees, and being the site of Napoleon Bonaparte's final victory. Not his most famous one, not his most decisive one, just final. This was June 16th, 1815, 2 days before Waterloo. 2 days before maps were redrawn, tempers were lost, and Mud was given a full-time job. But tonight, we're not in a hurry. We'll linger at the edge of the battlefield, where Prussian boots sloshed into place, French artillery wheeled slowly over uneven fields, and generals tried very hard to look like they had everything under control. Spoiler, they didn't. So take this moment to settle in. Tuck your blanket like it's a regimental coat. Adjust your pillow as if it were a terribly flat cavalry saddle. Light a candle, or better yet, imagine one sputtering on a rain-dampened writing desk in Napoleon's mobile headquarters, illuminating a map that will soon become irrelevant. And while you do all that, feel free to subscribe to the channel, unless you're already asleep, in which case, excellent work. Leave a comment, if you feel so moved, on what you would have done as a mid-level Prussian officer with no clear orders and slightly soggy boots. Or click, like if you think winning a battle should involve more than just pushing the other guy off a hill, temporarily. Let's begin. Quietly. Because at Ligny, the cannons did roar. But we'll make sure they don't wake you. The sun rose, technically, though in truth it slouched across a sky filled with low, petulant clouds. The kind of sky that doesn't commit to rain, but still ruins your afternoon. Below this indecisive ceiling, the low Belgian countryside waited quietly to become important for approximately 1 day. To the casual observer, and there were a few mostly confused villagers, it would have looked like the start of a modest agricultural fair gone terribly wrong. Fields trampled by boots that did not plant, horses that did not plough, and men in various states of preoccupation standing around holding weapons like they'd forgotten what they were for. At the centre of this soft chaos stood a village called Ligny. If you'd passed through it before the 16th, you might have described it as nice enough. A few thatched roofs, a church, narrow lanes suspiciously damp even in dry weather, and a stream, innocent, babbling, and completely unprepared to become a tactical point of contention for the French and Prussian armies. On the French side stood Napoleon Bonaparte, recently escaped from exile, recently re-employed as emperor, and recently reminded that time waits for no man, even if that man once crowned himself with his own hands. He had fewer troops than he wanted, fewer allies than he needed, but still managed to look like someone who believed he could bend fate by squinting at it hard enough. He had a plan. He always had a plan. And this one was not bad, not great, but functional in a let's see what happens if we poke them here kind of way. The idea was simple. Hit the Prussian army hard enough at Ligny to knock them out of the war, preferably forever, but he'd settle for the weekend. With the Prussians temporarily horizontal, Napoleon could then turn his attention to the Duke of Wellington's Anglo-Allied forces further west, divide and conquer, as they say, and then perhaps, just perhaps, France would belong to him again, without needing a refund policy. Facing him was Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, a name that sounds like someone sneezing into a helmet. He was Prussian, elderly, and built mostly of scar tissue and spite. Blücher was not known for nuance. He preferred to charge, sometimes into the enemy, sometimes into metaphors, occasionally into complete tactical disasters. But you had to admire his consistency. He believed in fighting, and in this case, he believed the French were the ones who needed a good trouncing. His troops had marched hard and arrived tired. There was some confusion about how to form up, where to place the artillery, and whether they were about to be flanked. But confusion was something armies of the 19th century wore like a second uniform. If the maps made sense, you were probably reading them upside down. The battlefield itself was squishy. That's the word. A patchwork of hedgerows, muddy lanes, damp fields, and occasional wheat patches that did absolutely nothing to absorb cannonballs. The village of Ligny ran along a stream, technically a brook, but one that was about to become famous for briefly resisting history. And then, of course, there was the hill. Every good European battle has one. A suspiciously raised piece of ground, just high enough to matter and just low enough for everyone to assume they can take it back later. In this case, the heights near Saint-Amand and Ligny gave whoever held them a slight advantage, which, in Napoleonic terms, meant you got to shoot downhill and feel good about yourself. Napoleon ordered his troops to take the villages flanking Ligny. The Prussians were already there, stacking up behind walls, inside homes, and behind anything that wouldn't fall over immediately. As the French advanced, the battle did what all good Napoleonic battles do, devolved into a series of grim, swirling, close-quarters messes that no one really understood until after the gunpowder cleared. Cannon fire, musket smoke, drums beaten by boys too young to understand what they were signalling, all wrapped in the unmistakable scent of burning hay, boiled leather, and the smell of thousands of nervous soldiers who'd had a very small breakfast. Tactically, the battle moved in waves. The French pushed, the Prussians held, the French pushed again. The Prussians pushed back, possibly out of boredom or habit. Villages changed hands, churches caught fire, horses panicked, officers pointed at things. Some were maps, others were pigeons. Morale remained ambiguous. And all the while, Napoleon watched from a nearby rise, perhaps imagining that this would be his great return to form. A battlefield where his genius would shine, his enemies would crumble, and history would have to revise its ending, which, in a way, did happen. By the end of the day, the French had taken Ligny. Technically, the Prussians had retreated. Technically, and Napoleon had won a victory. Technically. But it was a strange one. Blücher was injured, thrown from his horse, bruised, and briefly missing. But the Prussians were not destroyed, just annoyed and falling back, not to surrender, not to regroup, but to rejoin with Wellington, a move that would prove terribly inconvenient 2 days later. Napoleon, for his part, did not chase them with the urgency required, possibly because he believed they were no longer a threat, possibly because his troops were tired, possibly because even he couldn't remember what day it was anymore. But Ligny was his last victory, the final tick in a long list of battles fought with boldness and breathlessness. It just happened to be a battle that mattered less than it seemed. A win that left more questions than answers. A hill taken that wasn't quite worth climbing. And speaking of questions without satisfying answers, we now turn to the next part of this very sleepy campaign. What on earth was Marshal Grouchy doing? If ever there was a historical figure who seemed to embody the phrase, "I'm doing what you told me, exactly how you didn't mean it," it was Emmanuel de Grouchy, Marshal of France, and, through no fault of his own, the most gloriously unhelpful man of June 1815. To set the scene, we must imagine a man astride a horse. A fine horse, possibly damp, possibly confused, like its rider. Grouchy had just been given a rather important task by Napoleon himself, who, after securing a slippery victory at Ligny, needed someone to follow the retreating Prussians, not to destroy them necessarily, but to keep them from regrouping, or more to the point, to keep them from joining up with Wellington's forces near Brussels. Now, Grouchy was not an incompetent man. He was, in fact, diligent. He was educated. He had spent decades doing the whole general thing, He had polished boots and paper maps and subordinates with spectacular sideburns. But what Grouchy lacked on this critical, quietly disastrous day was initiative, that and a good pair of eyes. Because while the Prussian army was marching sideways through soggy country roads to reunite with Wellington, Grouchy was not. Instead, he was somewhere near Waver. He was following his orders. Technically, because the orders had said, follow the Prussians, and Grouchy, assuming they were going northeast, had committed to that direction like it was a wedding vow. Rain or shine, uphill or through the marsh, even when his aide suggested maybe they should perhaps just peek over the next ridge and see where the cannon fire was coming from. You know, just in case, he politely declined. He was not being disobedient, quite the opposite. He was being too obedient. And in war, especially Napoleonic War, obedience without interpretation is a bit like marching through a maze with a blindfold and an expired compass. As June 17th gave way to June 18th, Grouchy began hearing cannon fire in the distance. Loud, persistent, increasingly worrying. His officers approached him, some with subtle hints, others with increasing desperation, suggesting that perhaps, maybe, just maybe, the sound of hundreds of artillery pieces in the direction of Mont-Saint-Jean might be relevant. But Grouchy demurred. His orders were clear. He was to monitor the Prussians, not interfere with Wellington, not follow smoke, not listen to his instincts. No, he was to do precisely what he had been told, in the most inflexible, literal interpretation available to a man with field glasses and no imagination. And so, while the Battle of Waterloo erupted in the distance, while Wellington held the ridge and Napoleon waited for support that would never arrive, Grouchy calmly observed a quiet section of Belgium where, to the best of his knowledge, nothing important was happening. He even engaged in a small skirmish at Wavre. It was, by all accounts, inconclusive and unmemorable, which, unfortunately, describes his entire contribution to the campaign. There's a certain tragic poetry to Grouchy's behaviour, not the dramatic Shakespearean kind, more the sort you find in overwatered houseplants and half-read instruction manuals. Because while Napoleon desperately needed him to arrive, to tip the balance, to charge in and rescue what remained of French imperial destiny, Grouchy was instead on a kind of scenic tour. And perhaps we should be kind. After all, he wasn't disloyal. He wasn't cowardly. He was simply a man trying very hard not to do the wrong thing, and in doing so, achieved something far more disastrous. Absolutely nothing. And as the cannons thundered further west, as the fate of Europe leaned this way and that like a badly constructed tavern table, Grouchy remained fixed, diligent, obedient to a fault. By the time word reached him that the Battle of Waterloo had been lost, there was nothing left to do. No glory to be salvaged. No moment of redemption. Only a quiet retreat, a late report, and a place in history's most sleep-inducing footnotes. And so we turn our attention back to the battlefield proper, where Napoleon, having waited for Grouchy like a hopeful guest at an empty dinner table, now found himself facing the end of an empire. With mud in his boots, defeat on his brow, and destiny coughing politely in the background. But of course no story of Ligny or Waterloo is complete without the man who stood so stubbornly in Napoleon's way, wearing a hat that looked like it disapproved of everything. Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington, did not consider himself particularly brilliant. Others disagreed. To his critics, he was lucky. To his allies, steady. But to the soldiers who served under him, he was, without much flair, exactly what they needed. A commander who did not panic, did not improvise more than necessary, and, when required, could stand motionless in a field for hours while bullets snapped the air around him. On June 18, 1815, Wellington did not charge. He did not inspire with soaring speeches. He did not wave flags or make sweeping declarations of destiny. He stood, on a hill, in the rain, with his army arranged like a neat line of exasperated red-coated dominoes. And he waited. It wasn't a grand hill, mind you, more of a rise, a modest bump in the Belgian landscape. But from this modest bump, Wellington did the most radical thing one could do in Napoleonic warfare. He let the enemy come to him. He had been here before, metaphorically, in Portugal, in Spain. His talent was not in boldness, but in resilience. He didn't try to outmaneuver so much as outlast. And so, with the French army bearing down, he positioned his forces just behind the slope, out of direct artillery fire, and told them to hold the line. They did. For hours. They held as French cavalry swept in, sabres glinting beneath heavy skies. They held as artillery thundered mud into the air. They held even as French infantry closed the distance again and again, only to be pushed back by lines of muskets and absurdly disciplined volleys. At one point, Wellington stood near a hedge line so calm and so silent that a passing officer asked if he might move back. Wellington said no. He was where he needed to be. His presence, leaning slightly under a borrowed umbrella, casually chewing a piece of chicken, was both eerie and oddly effective. It was as though he had become a fixture of the landscape, part of the hill itself. In a way, Wellington's greatest weapon wasn't tactics, it was patience. He had no illusions of grandeur. His goal wasn't to win gloriously, but simply not to lose. And as long as the line held, as long as his troops could withstand just one more charge, one more bombardment, he believed the French would break before they did. And eventually, they did. But it wasn't entirely due to his efforts, because somewhere on the far side of the field, moving slowly through woods and lanes and fields of wet barley, came the Prussians, Blücher's battered but unyielding force, arriving just late enough to make Wellington's gamble seem clairvoyant. Together, Anglo-Allied and Prussian forces crushed what remained of Napoleon's final push. The French lines collapsed like a poorly packed trunk. The Old Guard, the last proud remnant of Napoleon's imperial elite, formed their square, refused to surrender, and were broken nonetheless. And Wellington. He reportedly muttered, "Night or the Prussians," shortly before both arrived. Then he turned, mounted his horse, and began the slow process of trying to clean up the mess that would be known as the end of the Napoleonic Wars. He did not cheer. He did not revel. He simply began the paperwork. So ended the battle. Not with fanfare, but with fatigue. Not in brilliance, but in resolve. But before we drift too far into conclusions, let us wander back just 2 days, to a smaller field with larger implications. Let us return to Ligny, Napoleon's last victory, and consider just how thin the line is between triumph and footnote. Because while Waterloo would become the legend, it was Ligny that made it inevitable. It is one thing to lose a battle. It is quite another to keep marching afterward as if you hadn't. Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, commander of the Prussian army, and a man whose military strategy occasionally resembled being thrown down a flight of stairs and landing in just the right place, had been decisively defeated at Ligny. On June 16, 1815, his troops were scattered, his lines broken, and he himself, because Prussian generals of the era were often made of boot polish and stubbornness, was literally trampled by cavalry. Most commanders, after such a defeat, might have limped away from the battlefield looking for wine, resignation papers, or a long, slow sulk. Blücher, instead, got patched up with vinegar and groans, stood upright with effort, and began planning how to ruin Napoleon's week. He did not retreat toward the east, towards safety and supply lines. That would have made sense. That would have been logical. Instead, he angled north, toward Wellington, because Blücher had promised, in what was either an act of alliance or old man defiance, that he would return. So while Napoleon took his victory at Ligny as confirmation that fate, cannons, and destiny were all still on his side, the Prussians were staggering northward through the mud, not fleeing, regrouping, bleeding, yes, limping, definitely, but not broken and not done. It wasn't elegant. The roads were a mess. The wounded were many. Units lost contact. Officers shouted across ravines. Packs were dropped in fields, it rained, shoes disintegrated, and at every point where another general might have called it quits, Blücher gritted what teeth he had left and muttered something about Napoleon and not yet. The Prussian high command, the actual thinkers of the army, like Gneisenau, considered pulling back farther. They understood that lines had been severed and morale was frayed, but Blücher, concussed and full of spirit, or possibly schnapps, insisted they push on, that they keep their appointment with Wellington, that they do not let Ligny be the last word. And so they marched, through soggy farms, across slippery hills, guided by half-maps and whole guesses, all to arrive, just in time, on the flank of the battlefield at Waterloo 2 days later. This movement, this decision to continue despite every reason not to, turned the tide. Napoleon had planned for Wellington alone. He did not expect the Prussians to return with such fury, such speed, and such irritating punctuality. But they did. Blücher's bruises became his badge. His resilience became legend. And Ligny, once a French triumph, was quietly downgraded to a Pyrrhic victory with mud on its boots. So while the cannons of Waterloo fired and Wellington's redcoats stood fast behind their ridgeline, it was the sound of the Prussian advance, the boots, the drums, the weary but unwavering return that undid Napoleon's final gambit. Victory, in military terms, is often a messy calculation. If you're standing upright and the other fellow isn't, you won. If you hold the field at nightfall, you won. If someone writes a poem about you afterwards, you probably won, especially if they didn't know you personally. By that logic, Napoleon won at Ligny. He had broken the Prussian lines. He had scattered their divisions. The sun set on French troops occupying the field, and Prussians very much not. The paperwork, if you will, said, "Victory, Napoleon." And yet, Ligny remains one of history's most frustrating near misses, the military equivalent of checking every box on the to-do list, except actually end the war. Napoleon had aimed to divide and conquer, wedge the British and Prussians apart, defeat them in turn, then enjoy retirement once again with better press. The first step appeared to be working. He smashed the Prussians. The second step, however, depended on ensuring they stayed smashed. They didn't. The problem wasn't just that Blücher got up after being trampled. The problem was that the French didn't pursue. Not properly, not forcefully, and not at all like men who knew this was their one final chance to prevent a coalition from uniting against them yet again. Grouchy, Napoleon's subordinate, a man whose very name implies a certain reluctance, was ordered to pursue the retreating Prussians. He did so with the kind of energy one uses to look for a lost sock, vaguely, without urgency, and mostly hoping it turns up on its own. By the time he realized the Prussians hadn't retreated east, but had instead turned north to rendezvous with Wellington, the Battle of Waterloo had already begun, and Grouchy was busy somewhere else, not contributing. What should have worked, the elegant separation of enemies and the decisive blows to follow, unravelled because of a curious mix of hesitation and hubris. Napoleon believed he had done enough, that the Prussians were dealt with, that Grouchy would do his job, that Wellington could be beaten alone. It all looked brilliant on the map, and as anyone who has ever assembled IKEA furniture using only the diagrams knows, things that look brilliant on paper can still fall over in reality. There was also the matter of fatigue. Napoleon's army was strong, but not invincible. It had marched hard to get to Belgium. Supplies were patchy, weather was wet. Spirits were high, but knees were sore. The soldiers were seasoned, yes, but they were also human. Humans with limited tolerance for back-to-back battles against enormous coalitions of people who very much wanted them to stop being French in Belgium. And so, the victory at Ligny became a moment of false momentum. The kind of triumph that looks excellent in a bulletin but doesn't hold its weight in strategy. Because the enemy wasn't destroyed, they were just bruised and motivated. That, historically, is the worst kind of enemy. So Ligny was, in the end, a miscalculation dressed up as a success. The final win before the final loss. And while Napoleon's hat may have still been stylish and his cavalry still dramatic, the thread of fate had begun to fray, quietly, softly, but with undeniable finality. From here, the path leads toward the rolling fields of Waterloo, where cannons would thunder, boots would slip, and destiny would finally get a word in. But before we let Wellington have his napless afternoon of fame, let's pause briefly for the horses. Yes, the horses. The horses, the unsung workhorses of empire, quite literally. In any Napoleonic campaign, especially one with delusions of grandeur and a tight deadline, your cavalry is your scalpel, your hammer, and your impromptu form of long-distance intimidation. But horses, unlike muskets or canteens, do not travel lightly, nor do they reload quickly. They eat, constantly. They panic at loud noises. They mysteriously injure themselves while tied up and unattended. And if you bring 50,000 of them into Belgium, you'd better be prepared to feed half of Belgium to them. By the time of Ligny, the French army was already dangerously well acquainted with the complexities of equine maintenance. Fields around the campaign trail had been chewed into oblivion. Quartermasters, those long-suffering supply officers who frequently aged in reverse, were beginning to resemble sleep-deprived mathematicians at a barley auction. Wagon loads of fodder moved slowly behind the army, far too slowly to keep up with the appetite of a full cavalry wing. Horses began to founder. Shoeing became inconsistent. And as it turns out, tired horses with aching hooves and insufficient oats are not the ideal foundation for a fast-moving, shock-based pursuit of the enemy. It didn't help that in wet June weather the roads became muddy arteries of indecision. Wagons bogged down, hooves slipped, and cavalry commanders, often more stylish than practical, demanded speed without accepting the logistics required to produce it. Even Napoleon, who understood supply better than most, couldn't conjure dry oats out of the air or pave roads with optimism. Some of the horses were requisitioned from the surrounding countryside. Farmers woke to find their plough horses had joined the emperor's entourage. Others simply fell behind and were left to graze wherever the campaign passed them by. In the village wake of the Grande Armée, you'd often find a tired man with one boot and a tethered mare that no longer trusted him. A living metaphor for the whole campaign, really. Yet despite all this, cavalry remained central to Napoleon's image of warfare, the thunder of hooves, the blur of sabres, the iconic charge that would scatter infantry and punch holes through enemy lines. It was all part of the theatre. And theatre mattered, especially in a battle that, like Ligny, needed spectacle to reinforce its message. So when you imagine the battlefield of Ligny, do not forget the cavalry. Or, more accurately, do not forget what it took to have cavalry. The tonnage of feed, the endless farrier work, the rolling clouds of horseflies, the sheer physical noise of a battlefield with thousands of animals trying not to trip over each other in formation. And behind it all, the men responsible for keeping these creatures functioning. The grooms, the blacksmiths, the handlers, the ones who were kicked more often than saluted. Their work rarely made it into the glory reports. But without them, France's final victory might have looked less like tactical brilliance and more like an elegant traffic jam, which, some historians would argue, it kind of was anyway. And speaking of traffic jams, this seems like the right time to pivot toward communication. The battlefield, after all, doesn't run itself. Orders must be sent, scouts dispatched, runners galloping through confusion and cannon smoke must somehow reach their targets before everything changes again. There is something strangely poetic, if mildly catastrophic, about military communication before the invention of reliable radios. Picture it. An empire balanced on the back of a handwritten note, carried at a gallop through a landscape that no one had bothered to map properly. It's less like chess, and more like sending a carrier pigeon into a wind tunnel and hoping for the best. At Ligny, the French command structure relied on messages, couriers, and sheer optimism. Orders were scribbled quickly, sealed with haste, and handed to exhausted horsemen already caked in a fine crust of mud, soot, and bad decisions. These riders then had the unenviable task of threading their way through smoke-covered fields, narrow village lanes, and enemy cavalry patrols who had absolutely no interest in letting someone deliver a letter that might change the outcome of the battle. These weren't messages like, "We're attacking at dawn" or "Meet at the windmill." No, these were essays, multi-paragraph reflections on troop positions, estimated timings, and sometimes vague philosophical statements about the need to press the advantage or hold firm. Napoleon, famously fond of micromanaging through notes, would issue 6 orders before breakfast and expect all of them to be executed before his coffee went cold, which was problematic since his coffee rarely went cold, and not all of his marshals could read his handwriting. So, naturally, chaos ensued. Field Marshal Grouchy, a name now immortalized as the man who could not quite grouchy fast enough, received instructions that were either too vague, too late, or entirely beside the point. Grouchy had been tasked with following the Prussians after their retreat, an important job if your goal is to keep them from reinforcing your next battle. But Grouchy's understanding of pursue leaned more toward a light jog and the occasional inquiry at roadside inns. His small army shadowed the Prussians in a way that suggested he might be writing a travelogue instead of conducting a military operation. Meanwhile, on the battlefield at Ligny, Napoleon waited for confirmations that never came. His messages, like shy party invitations, were sent out into the wild with the assumption that someone would RSVP. But couriers got lost. Horses threw shoes. One message ended up in the wrong hands. Another arrived several hours late, by which point it was mostly useful as a footnote to explain why the cannons were already packed up. This breakdown in communication wasn't entirely new. Napoleon's campaigns had always depended on the fragile ballet of dispatch and response. But at Ligny, the stakes were tighter. The Prussians were wily, mobile, and more motivated than they had been in previous seasons. They regrouped quickly, and unlike their French pursuers, they had less of a penchant for writing novels in the form of strategic orders. And still, despite all the fumbled messages and misunderstood intentions, the French managed to win at Ligny. Barely. The Prussians withdrew in good order, which in military terms is like saying they lost politely. And while the French could claim victory on the battlefield, their failure to follow through, logistically, strategically, and especially communicatively, set the stage for Waterloo, where everything would fall apart like a soggy baguette under too much pressure. But at Ligny, in the brief moment between confusion and consequence, there was still hope. Hope that Grouchy might show up in the right place. Hope that the Prussians might vanish into the mist forever. Hope that the next message wouldn't get eaten by a courier's horse, which was not unheard of. And as the sun set over Belgium, casting long shadows across fields littered with broken gear and unopened orders, a familiar fatigue crept in. The kind that doesn't just settle in your bones, but burrows into your logistics chain. Victory, by most conventional definitions, suggests finality. Trumpets, celebrations, the planting of flags, and the scribbling of dates into history books. But Ligny was the sort of victory that made even the winners feel hesitant. Like when you finish a long, complicated board game and realize you were playing by the wrong rules. Or you win a pie-eating contest and immediately question your life choices. Yes, Napoleon technically won at Ligny. He forced the Prussians to retreat. They pulled back, battered and winded, across the rain-damp fields of Belgium. Cannons fell silent. Boots squelched away into the distance. The French army remained on the field, which, in military terms, meant they had earned the right to say, "We won," aloud, to themselves, quietly, so no one asked too many questions. But something was missing, a certain satisfaction, the sense that things had been settled decisively. Because while the French stood tall in the mud and declared victory, the Prussians were already reassembling themselves like a particularly durable puzzle. Their retreat wasn't disorganized, it wasn't panic, it was tactical, controlled. like a dog backing slowly out of a room while maintaining eye contact. Napoleon needed more than that. He needed the Prussians crushed, scattered, vanished into the marshes. Instead, they simply moved, east and north, toward Wavre, leaving behind just enough misdirection to confuse French scouts and delay French action. Napoleon assumed they were headed somewhere else entirely. Grouchy believed they were further than they were, and nobody stopped long enough to question why the Prussian cannon fire still sounded vaguely confident. This, as it turned out, was a problem. Napoleon, ever the strategist, had calculated a gap. He believed he had pried open the Allied coalition at the seam, separating the Prussians from the Anglo-Allied forces under Wellington, and that gap, if maintained, meant he could pick them off one at a time, divide and conquer. Classic textbook stuff, but the gap wasn't real, or rather, it wasn't big enough. The Prussians regrouped faster than expected. Wellington, ever the fan of contingency, didn't run, but rather waited, dug in, and sent messages of his own, ones that were not, it seems, eaten by horses or lost in hedgerows. Meanwhile, Grouchy, who was supposed to be pressuring the Prussians and keeping them from reaching Wellington, wandered toward Wavre with all the urgency of a man searching for his misplaced spectacles. He arrived late, engaged the wrong forces, and effectively spent 2 critical days marching toward an increasingly irrelevant objective. Ligny, then, became a false summit, a hill crested with great effort only to reveal a taller one ahead. Napoleon stood atop it, victorious in posture, but squinting uncertainly at the horizon. He could not yet see the storm gathering westward at Waterloo, where the coalition was quietly knitting itself back together into something formidable, muddy boots and all. And in the haze of that June evening, amid the smoke and spent musket balls, the battlefield at Ligny fell quiet. French soldiers slumped against broken carts. Prussian wounded were gathered and carried away by moonlight. And somewhere in a makeshift tent, Napoleon traced the next day's moves in charcoal on a map that would soon, quite literally, lead to his downfall. But that's another story. For now, the fields around Ligny sleep under a weighty stillness, a victory written in ink that had barely dried, a win that felt more like a pause, a breath between battles, a moment of quiet before the cannons thundered again. So rest, if you can. Fold the map, unlace the boots, let the campfires burn low. The next march begins soon. And while tonight Napoleon may have claimed the day, it is history, slow, relentless, and mildly disappointed, that will have the final word. Between the so-called victory at Ligny and the thunderous catastrophe at Waterloo lay a peculiar stretch of time, less celebrated, less studied, and blessedly more confusing. A 48-hour window in which messengers rode, orders frayed, and 2 armies, one hopeful-ish, attempted to navigate Belgium's June humidity and their own ambitions without tripping over their plans. This is where Marshal Emmanuel de Grouchy enters, or rather doesn't, depending on how you look at it. You may remember Grouchy as the man Napoleon tasked with pursuing the retreating Prussians after Ligny. Fix them in place, Napoleon may have said. Harass them, slow them down, delay their union with Wellington at all costs. In principle, a simple task. In execution, about as graceful as a dance performed in wooden clogs by someone who didn't hear the music. Grouchy took his command seriously. He marched, certainly. His soldiers trudged dutifully through churned-up farmland, under sun and light rain, along narrow roads bordered by high hedges and lower expectations. He even engaged some Prussian units at Wavre, like a man convinced he was doing something strategically vital, while nearby, the rest of history prepared to happen without him. But here's the sleepy tragedy. Grouchy had no idea Waterloo was about to explode in cannon smoke and destiny. The sounds of battle, distant, ominous, rumbled across the countryside like thunder on a warm night. Officers strained to interpret them. Was it an engagement, an ambush, a poorly timed wedding? There were moments when Grouchy's aides-de-camp suggested bold action, turning west, riding to Napoleon's aid, a desperate march to the sound of guns. But Grouchy, in that special style of bureaucratic loyalty, chose to follow his orders to the letter, though not necessarily their spirit. He stayed the course, watched the Prussians slip away, and played a critical supporting role in one of the great missed connections of military history. Meanwhile, the Prussians, tired, battered, but not broken, had regrouped with a resilience that continues to irritate French historians. Under Field Marshal Blücher, who had already survived being trampled by horses earlier in the campaign, a detail that feels more metaphorical than it probably was, they pivoted west with breathtaking speed. Their path was long, their coordination astonishing, and their arrival at Waterloo, timed with all the drama of a third-act twist, would seal the fate Napoleon had tried to avoid. But back to Grouchy, still squinting at Wavre, moving pieces around a board that no longer mattered. When word of the disaster at Waterloo finally reached him, it did so not like a thunderclap, but more like a breeze carrying the scent of something burnt and unrecoverable. The opportunity had passed. The mistake was sealed. The war, if not quite over, was now playing its closing notes. It's tempting to paint Grouchy as a villain in this sleepy tale, or at least a tragically dull side character. But his error wasn't malice. It was clarity in the wrong direction, a loyalty so literal it became useless. In the great theatre of Napoleonic warfare, he was the man who showed up with all the right intentions, on the wrong stage. And so, as night draped itself once again over Belgium's sodden fields, Grouchy and his troops bivouacked quietly, unaware that history had shifted while they marched. A ghost victory at Ligny behind them, a ghost battle at Waterloo just missed, and ahead, disbandment, retreat, and footnotes in dusty volumes. So fluff your blanket, dear listener. Nestle deeper into your candle-lit imaginings. Because history, even when it marches confidently, is often no more than a collection of people slightly too late or slightly too sure. It's the early hours of June 19th, 1815. The battlefield at Waterloo, once a cacophony of musket fire, cannon smoke, and shouted orders, now lies still. The soil, churned by thousands of boots and hooves, holds the weight of shattered ambition. A soft rain begins to fall, not dramatically, just enough to turn powder-blackened uniforms into soggy blankets and to tamp down the last wisps of gun smoke into the earth. In the quiet that followed the battle, there was no rousing anthem, no conclusive trumpet, just the slow realization that the day had come and gone and everything had changed, or ended. Napoleon Bonaparte, for the second and final time, had lost it all. But the strange part, at least for sleepy historians like us, is just how little anyone grasped the scale of what had just occurred. The French army didn't crumble all at once. In some parts of the battlefield, units stood intact, their drums silent, unsure if they were defeated or simply waiting. Couriers stumbled through the night, horses lame, uniforms caked in mud and confusion, delivering half-true reports to generals who weren't sure whether to regroup or retire permanently. And Napoleon? He departed the battlefield not in a blaze of fury, but rather in something more resembling a state of disappointed paperwork. He issued orders. He contemplated strategies. But the weight of it, of fate's final shrug, had already settled on his shoulders like an overlong campaign cloak. The Prussians, for their part, took some time to fully appreciate that they had, in fact, arrived just in time to swing the balance. The British, under Wellington, were likewise unsure whether they had won the day decisively or just outlasted it. Victory, as it turns out, isn't always immediately obvious, especially not in an age without satellite maps, digital communication, or fast food. It was mostly discovered by walking around in the morning and realizing that your enemy had either disappeared or stopped shooting. The battlefield itself offered no clarity, just a sprawl of broken wagons, abandoned sabres, wounded soldiers muttering in dozens of languages, and infantrymen sleeping where they stood, where they fell, or where no one noticed. There were horses that no longer moved, trees sheared in half by cannon blasts, a few cracked drums, and the occasional pack of cards lying face down, their game never finished. In the villages nearby, locals peeked from shuttered windows. Chickens resumed wandering. Children were ushered inside when unfamiliar uniforms approached. And throughout it all, The smell of smoke and wet leather lingered, a kind of unwanted cologne that wouldn't wash off for days. No one celebrated in the usual way. There were no gleaming parades, no clean-cut heroes, just men trying to boil coffee in battered pots over quiet fires, looking sideways at the horizon and wondering how much of Europe had just shifted in the last 24 hours. Napoleon would return to Paris, not with fanfare, but like a man returning from a failed business trip, exhausted, unshaven, and hoping nobody asked too many questions. The 100 days, which had begun with so much operatic flourish, now curled into a quiet ending, not with a sword, but with a sigh. And the soldiers? Most of them, once paid, packed, or pardoned, simply went home, if they had a home, or they lingered in garrison towns with new scars and older stories, or they drifted into other armies. Because history rarely ends with credits, it just mutters to itself until everyone wanders off. So if you're still awake, and no one would blame you if you aren't, let your thoughts meander through those silent Belgian fields, now sodden and still. Imagine the uniforms, now drying in barns, the boots removed beside quiet campfires, and somewhere, a general writing in a logbook, trying to make sense of a victory that looked suspiciously like exhaustion. Before the guns of Waterloo roared across the Belgian countryside, before boots churned up the soft June soil, and before any man in uniform remembered to regret his enlistment, there were maps, not just any maps, enormous ones, rolled out across long wooden tables in candle-lit rooms that smelled of ink, tobacco, and strategic optimism. And on those maps, dozens of coloured pins, tiny wooden markers, hand-scrawled notes like, "Advance here if it doesn't rain," and "Hold until further notice," or "Desert." In the weeks leading up to June 1815, the continent held its breath like someone who'd left the oven on and wasn't quite sure if it mattered anymore. Napoleon had returned from exile like a man who'd missed the party but showed up anyway, with fireworks. The monarchs of Europe, who'd only just gotten comfortable in their velvet-lined armchairs again, scrambled to remember how one wages a war against a man who didn't seem to stay defeated. All across Europe, dusty military uniforms were hastily refitted. Buttons were sewn back onto greatcoats, horses were requisitioned, drums were tuned, and generals who had been enjoying quiet retirements in the countryside found themselves summoned to polished floors and told they were important again, terribly, inconveniently important. Napoleon's plan, as usual, was elegant on paper and impossible in real life. He would strike first, move fast, split the enemy forces before they could unite. The Prussians, under Blücher, would be pushed east. The Anglo-Allied army, led by the always practical Duke of Wellington, would be forced west. And if all went well, neither would realise they were doomed until it was far too late for historical footnotes. Of course, the Prussians and British had maps too, and scouts, and increasingly frantic letters exchanged across country roads by riders who always seemed to arrive a few hours later than they should have. What followed was not so much a coordinated strategy as a continent-wide version of Where's Napoleon, in which every side tried to guess where the short man in the grey coat might appear next, and whether he was bringing 40,000 men with him. Meanwhile, civilians in Belgium found themselves on the front porch of history's latest gamble. Farmhouses were commandeered, cabbage fields were trampled, entire villages were turned into military supply depots with little notice and even less appreciation. Officers knocked politely and requested billets. Soldiers knocked less politely and requested anything edible. And quartermasters, armed with little more than long lists and bad tempers, did their best to requisition hay, wine, soap, and approximately 1 million pairs of boots. Napoleon, it must be said, moved quickly. With an army leaner and arguably more loyal than ever, he surged north into Belgium in mid-June, striking before his enemies could finalise their coffee orders, let alone their battle plans. His troops, veterans of countless campaigns, marched with the grim resolve of men who knew the drill. They weren't here to explore Belgium. They were here to win it. By June 15th, his forces had crossed the Sambre River. The French eagle flew again, and everything felt momentarily cinematic, except, of course, for the Prussians, who suddenly found themselves scrambling to consolidate at Ligny, and the British, who were pulled out of more than one tavern to rejoin their regiments. Messages flew, horses galloped, rain fell, Cannons were dragged through muddy roads with all the enthusiasm of a reluctant ox. And somewhere, Wellington raised an eyebrow and likely muttered something terribly British. It was a war of haste and intuition, not neat scheduling. Forces stumbled toward their positions under the flickering guidance of lanterns and assumptions. Camps were set up in fields that would soon be infamous. And scouts, always the unsung heroes of battlefield logistics, skulked through unfamiliar terrain, memorizing hillsides that would shortly be soaked in gunpowder and second thoughts. No one slept well. And yet, despite all this careful chaos, the outcome, like most grand historical climaxes, rested less on sweeping strategy and more on miscommunication, mud, and sheer dumb luck. But we'll get to that. By the afternoon of June 16th, 1815, the village of Ligny, a modest cluster of buildings nestled between creeks, wheat fields, and the general indifference of Belgian weather, had become the place where destiny paused to tie its boots. The sky above was that particular shade of pre-thunder grey, the kind that makes even the most veteran soldier feel like he forgot something important back at camp, like armour or an excuse. To the casual observer, Ligny did not look like the kind of place empires would wager themselves upon. It looked like the kind of place where cows outnumber people and gossip travels faster than orders. A few narrow roads, some stone cottages, and small bridges crossing sluggish streams that only qualified as rivers in official French dispatches. But on this day, Ligny was about to become a muddy chessboard, upon which thousands of pawns marched to their final, extremely loud appointments. Napoleon had chosen the field with his usual confidence and slightly theatrical flair. Ligny sat between two Prussian corps, positioned just far enough apart that they couldn't hug each other in time. To Napoleon, this was ideal. Divide and conquer, rinse and repeat, ideally before dinner. The French army, nearly 68,000 strong, began forming up with their characteristic efficiency and light grumbling. Muskets were checked, sabres were drawn and resheathed repeatedly, largely for the aesthetic. Drummers took their positions and tried not to look as tired as they felt. And officers rode along the lines on horses that were beginning to regret every decision they'd made since the Pyrenees. Opposing them, the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blücher was still in the process of assembling. And if the French army moved like a well-oiled mechanism, the Prussians moved like a determined but slightly overcomplicated grandfather clock. With more than 80,000 troops spread across a long front, the Prussian position was both robust and deeply inconvenient to command. Their advantage was numbers. Their disadvantage was being slightly too surprised to be properly dramatic about it. The town of Ligny itself was a tangled web of narrow lanes and stone walls, perfect for defence and dreadful for communication. The surrounding villages, Saint-Amand, Vagnelay, and others you've probably only heard of in the footnotes of history books, were about to become the kind of names schoolchildren never enjoy memorising. The French, for all their strategic bravado, began the attack somewhat late in the afternoon. There were delays. There always are. Orders misdelivered, roads muddier than anticipated, cannons that refused to cooperate, and infantry who, upon seeing the Prussian defences, developed an urgent need to tie their boots very slowly. When the assault finally began, it was loud, chaotic, and accompanied by what military historians politely call heavy casualties. The town of Saint-Amand saw some of the fiercest fighting, with French troops trying repeatedly to pry stubborn Prussians from stone houses using bayonets, grenades, and pure exhaustion. Ligny itself turned into a brutal slog. The streams that once trickled calmly through the town quickly turned murky red as units advanced, fell, and advanced again. Cannons thundered from ridges that offered marginal elevation but excellent acoustics. Smoke thickened until even officers weren't quite sure who was winning, only that everyone was running out of ammunition and metaphors. Throughout the battle, Blücher, aged, battle-hardened, and fueled mostly by defiance and poor medical advice, rode up and down the lines, urging his troops to hold. He wore no armour, of course, just a general's uniform, a pair of incredibly stubborn boots, and the kind of glare that could cow a stallion. Napoleon, in contrast, observed from a ridge, occasionally issuing commands with the calm demeanour of a man still trying to make his calendar work. He had no idea Wellington was already engaging Marshal Ney to the west at Quatre Bras, nor that this battlefield, while a tactical win, would do almost nothing to prevent the Allied armies from linking up 2 days later. But for now, the battle at Ligny thundered on. French infantry pushed hard into the Prussian centre. The Imperial Guard remained ominously in reserve, a looming threat no one wanted to think too much about. And the Prussians, battered but unbowed, held on longer than they probably should have. Eventually, late into the evening, the French Imperial Guard was committed. The assault finally broke the Prussian lines. It was technically a victory for Napoleon. Blücher himself was injured, thrown from his horse and narrowly rescued by loyal troops. The Prussians withdrew eastward, not in a rout, but in a measured, bitter retreat that left behind enough confusion for everyone to argue about it in military memoirs for decades. As the sun dipped behind the smoky horizon, the field was silent, except for the groans of the wounded and the occasional metallic sigh of cooling artillery. Thousands lay dead or dying, and the air smelled of spent powder, trampled wheat, and the uniquely difficult odour of heroic failure. Napoleon had won, but the Allied armies had not been destroyed. They had merely separated, and in doing so had unwittingly given him the illusion that everything was going exactly to plan. After the Battle of Ligny faded into the thick, sour smoke of near victory, the field lay heavy with silence and the distinctive smell of wet uniforms, gunpowder, and trampled barley. Napoleon, believing he'd successfully swatted the Prussians into disarray, turned his attention westward toward Wellington, assuming, quite confidently, that Blücher and his Prussians would now limp off into some less relevant corner of Belgium and stay there. They did limp, yes, but they didn't stay gone. Because what followed was not a collapse. It was a reorganization, a deeply muddy, underfed, overstrained reorganization carried out by men who, by all rights, should have quit and gone home to write poetry about how badly their feet hurt. Instead, the Prussian army, still under the grizzled and recently horse-crushed Field Marshal Blücher, began its slow, sodden trudge northward. The roads were treacherous, not just from recent rains, but because no one had designed them with retreating armies in mind. Wagons broke down, shoes disintegrated, horses gave up and became soup. But the men moved, slowly, with the deliberate tenacity of soldiers who'd just been reminded why they hated the French. Blücher, despite his injuries and age, refused to leave the field, or the conversation. He insisted the Prussians were not defeated, just momentarily out of position. He made it clear they would rejoin Wellington, come hell, high water, or whatever passed for road signage in the Belgian countryside. His chief of staff, the impressively named August von Gneisenau, was a little more pragmatic, but no less determined. He was not known for warm optimism, but he was terrifyingly good at organizing. With a flurry of orders and a knack for improvisation that would have made a dinner party host proud, he rerouted battered corps northward to Wavre, a town you've likely never heard of, but which became the unlikely hinge upon which European history would swing. The march itself was less like a parade and more like an ambulatory disaster. Columns of men stumbled through rain-soaked fields and churned up forest paths. Supplies were low, morale wobbled, yet somehow the Prussians, through grit, discipline, and the uncanny ability to ignore logistical probability, began to coalesce again. They communicated with Wellington, they promised support, and for once, everyone did what they said they would. Wellington, meanwhile, was holding the line at Waterloo and probably wondering whether help would arrive before the French did. It was the 19th century equivalent of waiting for the cavalry while hearing hoofbeats and not being sure if they're coming to help or ruin your day. But the Prussians were indeed coming. Bruised but not broken, bleeding but not panicked, they were on the move. Their pace wasn't fast, but it was relentless, and somewhere along the muddy paths and whispered orders, they did something extraordinary. They turned a strategic defeat into a delayed advantage. Napoleon, for all his tactical brilliance, did not see it coming. He had counted the Prussians out, believed them shattered, and so, when June 18th dawned on the fields of Waterloo, he would begin his famous final battle without fully realizing that Blücher and his battered, rain-drenched ghosts were already creeping back onto the stage. Dawn broke slowly on June 18th, 1815, though broke might be too dramatic a word. The sky merely lightened, as if reluctant to commit to another day of rain-slick confusion and poorly timed heroism. The fields near Waterloo were sodden, the air thick with the kind of humidity that sticks to uniforms and optimism alike. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster crowed. It was not immediately clear whether this rooster belonged to the French, the British, or the confused civilians who were now regretting their decision to live within artillery range of a Napoleonic grudge match. Napoleon awoke, allegedly refreshed, though one imagines even a military genius has limits when sleeping next to maps and under the crushing weight of his own legacy. He had won at Ligny 2 days before, technically, but the victory had been more of a stiff shove than a knockout, and the Prussians had not stayed down. Still, Napoleon had a plan. He always had a plan. It usually involved separating his enemies, striking one decisively, and then pivoting with operatic flair toward the next. So far, that strategy had served him well enough to terrify most of Europe. And now, with the British under Wellington dug in at Waterloo and the Prussians presumably still licking their wounds somewhere to the east, Napoleon was ready to conclude this Belgian adventure in style. His army, the Armée du Nord, was experienced but tired. Rain had delayed everything. Horses were uncooperative. Cannons, which are essentially glorified rolling bathtubs, refused to be dragged across mud without protest. Still, morale was not bad. These were men who had followed Napoleon through worse, and they had every reason to believe they might win again. They were facing the British, after all. Brave, yes, but famously fond of standing still and hoping tradition would do the rest. Across the field, the Duke of Wellington was awake early, possibly too early. He had slept under a tree the night before, which sounds poetic until you consider Belgian mosquitoes and the existential weight of leading a coalition army against Napoleon Bonaparte. Wellington was a man known for underplaying everything. If you handed him a flintlock pistol and told him the world was ending, he'd probably shrug and ask about breakfast. His forces were dug in along a low ridge near Mont Saint-Jean, an unremarkable geographical feature that was about to become very famous. The Allied army was a patchwork of British, Dutch, Belgian, and German troops, some veterans, some enthusiastic amateurs. Their cohesion was questionable, their accents were incompatible, but Wellington's genius was less about grand strategy and more about making the absolute best out of chaotic ingredients. As the hours ticked by, soldiers from both sides stood in formation, shifting their weight in the mud, listening to officers bark orders and wondering if it would be over by lunch. Cannons were aligned, cavalry tightened their saddles, drums rolled, bugles tried their best in the damp air, and still the Prussians did not appear. Napoleon had sent Marshal Grouchy after them 2 days before, like a parent dispatching an older sibling to keep the toddlers out of the kitchen. Grouchy, loyal but not necessarily fast, was marching somewhere with 33,000 men, convinced he was still chasing Blücher's retreating army. What he did not know, or did not accept, was that Blücher had pivoted. He wasn't retreating. He was regrouping, quietly, mud-soaked, but inexorably. So Napoleon prepared for battle, believing he had time, that he could crush Wellington before Blücher arrived. That victory was a matter of punctual cannonade and competent marching. He was half right, because by midday the field was churned, the guns were finally dry enough to fire, and the French began to advance. It was the start of a long, thundering, increasingly chaotic day, a day when legends would be made, myths would be shattered, and more than one commanding officer would lose their horse, their hat, and their patience. But before the thunder of hoofbeats and the roll of musket fire could truly begin, all sides held their breath. It was a moment of eerie calm, a pause, the kind of stillness that history always holds just before it breaks. And somewhere, on the far side of the field, through trees and mist and prayers that smelled faintly of pipe smoke and boiled cabbage, the Prussians were still coming. If the morning of Waterloo began with a theatrical clearing of throats and ceremonial posturing, the afternoon unfolded like a series of increasingly unhinged stage directions. What began as maneuvers became muddles. What was meant to be a masterstroke turned into something with more hoofprints than heroism. And in the middle of it all, a glorious, muddy ballet, the cavalry charge. Now, for those unfamiliar with 19th century warfare, congratulations on your good fortune. It's helpful to understand that cavalry charges were essentially the Napoleonic equivalent of rolling the dice very loudly. When successful, they could shatter infantry lines like a fork through overcooked vegetables. When unsuccessful, which was often, they became elaborate exercises in dramatic horse choreography, followed by regret. Marshal Ney, sometimes called the bravest of the brave, and perhaps less generously, the most enthusiastic misinterpreter of context, took it upon himself to launch one of these bold gestures, or rather, several. After spotting what he assumed was the collapse of Wellington's centre, a perfectly understandable mistake, given all the standing still, it seemed like the perfect time to charge, and charge again and again. Thousands of French cavalrymen surged across the field like a very committed misunderstanding. Shiny breastplates glinted, plumes bobbed, horses, majestic and slightly bewildered, thundered through the mud toward Wellington's squares of infantry, who had formed into hollow boxes like picnic tables made of gunpowder. British infantry squares, you see, were specifically designed to say, "No, thank you," to cavalry. With bayonets bristling outward and steady volleys of musket fire, they held, again and again. The French cavalry wheeled around, regrouped, and tried again. The result was something between a siege and a repetitive stress injury. For hours, the square formation stood like stubborn hedgerows of discipline and sheer irritation. The French cavalry was brave, heroic even. They were also increasingly exhausted and, crucially, unsupported by infantry or artillery, because no one had told the other branches of the army what Ney was doing. It was, in essence, a one-man decision affecting thousands of men and several hundred increasingly damp horses. A symphony of exertion without a conductor. Meanwhile, Wellington continued to do what he did best, hold the line and wait. He was not a general prone to sweeping maneuvers or poetic last stands. His strategy was endurance, trusting that if his troops held just long enough, something would tip the balance. That something, of course, was on the way. To the east, beyond the woods of Plancenoit, a rising murmur was turning into a roar. The Prussians, yes, those same Prussians who had been so thoroughly defeated at Ligny, had shown up. Late, yes. Muddy, certainly. But with a determination born of collective embarrassment and a desire to ruin Napoleon's afternoon. Blücher, the Prussian commander, was 72 years old, suffering from injuries and possibly held together by willpower and brandy alone. But he had promised Wellington he would come, and he had brought tens of thousands of men with him to prove it. As the day darkened, they began pouring into the French right flank like a bucket tipped just enough to spill. Napoleon, realizing this was no longer a tidy two-party conflict, scrambled to adjust. He sent forces to hold Plancenoit. He repositioned what reserves he could. But the rhythm of the battle was slipping, the tempo faltering. Where once he had danced with destiny, now he was elbowing for space. Back on the main line, the Imperial Guard, Napoleon's elite troops, never before broken, prepared for their final march. If you were writing this as fiction, this would be your climactic charge. Disciplined veterans advancing into the setting sun with nothing but glory or ruin ahead. But even legends have expiration dates. As the Guard advanced, British and Allied troops unleashed a thunderous volley. The line staggered. The Guard hesitated, then broke. For the first time in their storied history, they turned and retreated. Not in chaos, but with the heavy gravity of myth unraveling. The French army, watching their finest falter, began to follow. Night fell not with fireworks or heroics, but with boots slipping in darkness and whispered confessions of defeat. Napoleon's last gamble had failed, and as the soldiers of Europe exhaled, the battlefield grew quiet. Not peaceful, just spent. But that silence, that breath after the battle, we'll save that for the final reflection. So for now, dear listener, let your mind drift like smoke from an extinguished cannon. Let hoofbeats echo faintly, somewhere between memory and myth. You're safe now, in the gentle aftermath of history's grandest miscommunications. There's something delightfully human about an emperor bringing too much luggage to a battlefield. As dawn crept over the Belgian countryside in mid-June of 1815, dew clung to the barley, the cavalry snorted into the mist, and somewhere just beyond the front lines, a small cluster of servants wrestled with an overstuffed trunk. Inside were silk waistcoats, monogrammed napkins, and at least one small golden coffee set. Because if you were Napoleon Bonaparte, you didn't just conquer Europe, you did it while sipping properly heated chocolate from porcelain. The Hunnic saddlebag this was not. By the time of the Battle of Ligny, the emperor had become, for lack of a gentler word, a man of habits. Specific linens, a carefully curated travel silverware kit, a valet who knew how to warm boots without burning them, a daily bath schedule, observed even on campaign, with an expression of someone affronted by the concept of dirt. The man who once stormed bridges with cannon fire was now mildly irritated by creased shirts. His military camp, you see, was less a tent village and more a wandering boutique hotel, complete with maps, mirrors, and people whose job titles included phrases like Imperial Groom of the Backup Horse. Somewhere along the way, warfare had become a matter of aesthetic. That wasn't necessarily a problem, unless you were the men trying to follow him across Belgian mud, lugging everything from maps to mattresses, while being occasionally shelled. Napoleon's baggage train, both physical and metaphorical, trailed behind him like a shadow embroidered in gold braid. Every campaign came with trunks of documents, portraits to boost morale, spare boots for his spare boots, and medical supplies for an emperor who detested pain, but liked remedies with agreeable smells. His physicians, incidentally, were among the more exasperated members of the entourage. They were tasked with diagnosing a variety of complaints, from the mysterious stomach pains that plagued him to the more pressing battlefield anxiety of being shot at. But mostly, they waited nearby with tinctures and towels, while the emperor glared at an ominous sky and asked for his favourite chair. And of course, there were maps, endless maps. Hand-drawn, ink-splotched, and folded in ways that made no sense by candlelight. Napoleon, a master of logistics, liked to spread them dramatically across tables while other men worried about food. In Ligny, some of these maps turned out to be optimistic, possibly out of date, maybe even upside down at times. Still, they looked excellent unfurled beside a gilt-edged compass. The emotional baggage, too, was vast. This was the return from exile, the final campaign, the last great effort to reclaim glory before everything collapsed in on itself like an overly ambitious soufflé. Napoleon wasn't just bringing clothes to Ligny. He was dragging with him the weight of abandoned allies, the hopes of a France already tired of his comeback tour, and a sneaking suspicion that fate was no longer answering his letters. His generals saw it, even if they didn't say it aloud. The energy had shifted. The confidence remained, but the luck had thinned. At Ligny, he won the battle. Technically, on paper. The Prussians retreated. His forces held the field, but it was a messy victory, with timing delays, missing units, and a gnawing sense that something important, perhaps even someone, had been mislaid somewhere along the campaign route. Still, the tents were packed. The boots were brushed. The silver was stowed. Napoleon moved on from Ligny as he had moved through so many chapters of his life, efficiently, imperially, and with just a touch of eau de Cologne, which, if you'll follow me softly, brings us next to the subject of maps, mud, and misinformation, because no matter how finely pressed your uniform may be, it won't help you when you've confidently marched your entire army into the wrong village. Shall we unfold the map together? In theory, war is about movement. Armies go here, then there. Commands are given, formations shift, flanks are covered, and someone in a distant tent proclaims that victory is only a matter of geometry. In practice, especially during the muddy and deeply miscommunicated summer of 1815, movement was mostly about hoping your cavalry wasn't stuck in a ditch while your scouts argued about which hamlet was which. For Napoleon at Ligny, maps were supposed to be the solution. He loved them, adored them, slept near them. He traced fingers across rivers and ridges like a man conducting a symphony of conquest. Unfortunately, the real Belgian countryside didn't always agree with the ink and parchment version, especially not when that ink had been applied during better weather by someone who assumed every road would remain where it was put. The fields near Ligny, were a tangle of gently rolling confusion. Winding farm paths masqueraded as main roads. Small brooks pretended to be rivers. Villages bore names that changed spelling based on how tired the cartographer had been when labelling them. And, in at least one case, two entirely different places were given the same name, just to keep things festive. So when Napoleon tried to orchestrate a perfectly timed flanking manoeuvre, what he got instead was a small detour through some uncooperative barley fields, a series of increasingly bewildered couriers, and a general who arrived 3 hours too late because he'd been shouting questions at Flemish farmers who responded by offering beer. Mud, meanwhile, was everyone's silent companion. It sucked at boots, silenced wheels, and swallowed cannonballs with what could only be described as deliberate malice. It turned charges into trudges, and cavalry into very sad men on very stuck horses. Artillery was supposed to be the emperor's great strength, but when a field gun needs 6 men and a mule just to rotate 10 degrees, your chances of dramatic timing decrease sharply. Meanwhile, on the Prussian side, confusion reigned with equal enthusiasm. Their commander, the iron-willed but bodily battered Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, was operating on a combination of grit, guesses, and whatever information arrived damp and smudged from the front. He believed his left flank was solid, his centre reinforced, and his supplies on the way. In reality, none of these things were entirely true, but Blücher had long since committed to a strategy of firm confidence and audible yelling. At one point during the day, the Prussian command believed Napoleon's forces were in a completely different sector, based on a report delivered by a messenger who had, it turned out, been lost for nearly 3 hours and may have spent some of that time in the wrong army's camp. By the time the mistake was realized, the battle had moved on, without the courtesy of waiting. To coordinate a battle in 1815 was to orchestrate chaos with quill pens and rain-sogged boots. There were no radios, no satellites, no convenient group chats. Orders were written by hand, delivered by horse, and obeyed, sometimes by men who could barely see each other through the smoke. Messages disappeared. Entire brigades misunderstood verbs. And when dusk settled over Ligny, it did so on a battlefield where both sides were fairly certain they had misjudged at least half of the day's events. Napoleon, as it happened, believed the Prussians were more broken than they were. He assumed they would retreat east, away from Wellington. They did not. They retreated north, quietly, in good order, toward Waterloo, which would become, in less than 48 hours, rather important. But at Ligny, the battle had been won, at least by the technical definition. The Prussians had fallen back. The French had held their ground. There were cheers in the evening gloom, toasts made by candlelight, and dispatches sent with a confidence that would age poorly. Because sometimes in history as in life, the worst thing you can do is succeed just enough to make a much bigger mistake 2 days later. Now, if your eyes are still fluttering gently open, let's drift together toward the cavalry that showed up too late, the infantry that showed up too early, and the general consensus that no one showed up quite where they were supposed to. Shall we? Timing, in war, is everything. Or at least that's what military historians like to say, usually while sipping coffee in well-lit libraries. But on the actual fields of Ligny, timing was less a matter of strategy and more a game of chance played with mud, hoofbeats, and poor handwriting. Consider Marshal Grouchy, a man whose name would go down in history for not arriving at Waterloo in time to help Napoleon. But before that infamy, there was Ligny, where Grouchy was assigned a task so broad and vague it might as well have been written on a cloud. Napoleon sent him to pursue the Prussians, which sounds clear until you realize that the Prussians were several loosely connected corps. Pursue was left up to interpretation, and the maps were roughly as accurate as a whispered rumour. At Ligny, Grouchy was present, physically, if not always purposefully. He had cavalry, he had orders. What he didn't have was enough information to know whether he was reinforcing a battle, initiating one, or simply serving as an expensive decoration on the far flank. He marched, then waited, then marched again, then wrote down some thoughts in case anyone cared to know why he wasn't where he was supposed to be. They didn't, not until later. Meanwhile, other French commanders arrived early, aggressively early in fact. Infantry units stumbled onto the field of Ligny before all the cannons were in place, which gave them the pleasure of standing around in tight formation while artillery crews argued about angles and elevation. Nothing raises troop morale quite like watching an officer gesture repeatedly toward a hill while muttering that the sun's position makes it confusing. Then there was the Prussian right flank, which, through no fault of its own, entered the fray as if crashing a dinner party that had already devolved into food throwing. They were supposed to arrive in coordination with other Prussian units. They didn't. They were supposed to anchor the line. They couldn't. What they did manage to do was draw a large portion of Napoleon's forces toward them, which was brave, noble, and completely unsustainable. Back on the French side, coordination between units resembled an extended family trying to organize a group photo during a rainstorm. Everyone was technically present, but the poses were mismatched, and no one could hear the photographer. Entire battalions were sent to reinforce positions that had already fallen, while others were held in reserve because someone had heard, incorrectly, that a surprise Prussian counterattack was imminent from a direction that turned out to be a cow pasture. The irony, of course, was that both sides were trying to outmaneuver each other by moving faster than the other could react. But when your information is 4 hours old and delivered by a man who's been dodging musket fire on a borrowed horse, faster is really just less delayed. By the time night settled over Ligny, everything that was supposed to be perfectly timed had become either prematurely ambitious or fashionably late. The French believed the Prussians were broken. The Prussians believed they'd merely repositioned. Both were wrong, but in charmingly different ways. And so, with the battle technically concluded, and both sides pretending they had done what they meant to do, the soldiers lay down in fields that still smelled like smoke and damp barley. Horses stood tethered beside abandoned wagons. Officers huddled over lanterns, drafting reports that emphasized how many hills had been held, how few mistakes had been made, and how confident they were about what came next. Of course, what came next was Waterloo. But for now, here in the lingering haze of Ligny, it was enough to be done, if not entirely victorious, at least dry, and not currently being pursued. So let's drift there together, shall we? Through the quiet aftermath. Through the night watches and the tents that never quite blocked the wind. Toward the regrouping, the guessing, the plans drafted on soggy parchment with too little ink and too much optimism. Because sleep, like victory, comes easiest to those who believe they've done just enough, even when they haven't. Once the shouting fades and the musket barrels cool, the real work begins. Not the glorious kind with banners and decisive speeches, but the shuffling, sniffly aftermath known to military quartermasters and exhausted dragoons alike as clean-up. Ligny, for all its smoke and shouting, was still a battlefield. And winning a battlefield in 1815 was a bit like inheriting a barn during flood season, messy, inconvenient, and requiring far more buckets than you'd packed. Napoleon, in his usual efficient manner, declared victory. The Prussians had withdrawn, the field was technically in French hands, and his troops, many of whom could still stand, were now in control of a landscape full of trampled oats, discarded boots, and a disturbing number of horse teeth. But what does one do with a one battlefield? The answer, in short, is everything, and none of it glamorous. First came the wounded, moaning, coughing, occasionally singing, but mostly staring at the sky with expressions that said, "This was not in the pamphlet." Some were French, some were Prussian, and many were simply men with the same colour of blood in different uniforms. Medical care at the time was a curious mixture of heroic optimism and deeply unsettling improvisation. There were field surgeons who believed in the benefits of fresh air and claret, others who favoured boiling instruments between amputations, a radical innovation, and still others who had misplaced their spectacles and were simply hoping for the best. The dead were quieter, but no less demanding. By military custom, they had to be buried, documented, or at the very least moved off the road so that supply wagons could rattle past without upsetting the horses. Mass graves were hastily dug by soldiers with shovels and delicate constitutions. Names were written down, if legible, guessed if not. Dog tags, as we know them, didn't exist yet, so most identifications were made by checking coat linings, examining boots, or asking around. The margin for error was enormous. Then came the matter of the battlefield itself, scorched fields, broken wagons, and unexploded artillery shells that local children would later mistake for toys. Officers made notes on troop performance while eating cold stew out of tin bowls. Messages were sent, triumphantly or apologetically, depending on rank and proximity to the emperor. Napoleon himself paced, reviewed, nodded, dictated, and stared into middle distance as if seeing something just out of reach, perhaps the next battle, perhaps dinner. He wrote to Paris that the Prussians were routed. He was half right. They were routed, all the way to Wavre, where they'd spend the next 48 hours recovering, reorganizing, and preparing to appear exactly where Napoleon wouldn't want them. Meanwhile, Marshal Grouchy was dispatched to pursue them with vigor. Vigor, in this context, meaning that he took a slightly scenic route, asked a few locals the wrong questions, and eventually arrived just in time to miss the entirety of Waterloo, an absence for which history would never quite forgive him. Back at Ligny, the French soldiers rested. If they could find straw, they used it. If not, coats doubled as mattresses, stones as pillows. The battlefield was quieter now, except for the occasional neighing horse, the rustle of foraging dogs, and the echoing questions of junior officers trying to figure out where their regiments had wandered off to. A few entrepreneurial types took the opportunity to loot, nothing serious, just the odd watch, flask, or unguarded chicken. Locals began emerging from cellars and forests to see what was left of their homes, and to ask, somewhat nervously, how long the French intended to stay. No one had a satisfying answer, and yet, through it all, the mood was one of vague, resigned progress. Orders were written, boots repaired, coffee boiled in dented pots. The artillery crews, always the most serious, resumed polishing their cannons as if the next battlefield might be judged on aesthetics. The men knew something larger was coming. They didn't know it would be Waterloo. They didn't know the Prussians would reappear like a cold draft under a poorly fitted tent flap. But they suspected, as soldiers often do, that victory this neat and this quiet was never the end. So, let's not linger too long here in the field at Ligny. Let's keep moving gently forward into the growing dusk of June 17th. Napoleon will ride again. The roads will turn to mud. Letters will be written and lost. And Wellington, over 100 kilometers away, is beginning to make plans that involve many sharp angles and well-timed fences. Next, we drift toward the day between the battles, when history exhaled, slightly, before clenching again. And if your eyelids are already sinking like cannonballs in soft soil, that's perfectly fine. Just imagine the rhythmic clop of cavalry hooves in the distance and let it carry you onward, or off to sleep. June 17th, 1815, began not with a bang, but with damp socks. The kind of creeping, marrow-deep wetness that can only be delivered by a Belgian summer sky with a dark sense of humour. The battlefield at Ligny had gone quiet, but the clouds overhead were not in a mood to celebrate. They broke open in the early morning hours and did not close again for some time. French soldiers, victorious in name but exhausted in body, woke up in the drizzle, stretched limbs that had not been properly slept on, and began the business of pretending everything was under control. Bedrolls were shaken out and refolded. Canteens were checked. Maps were re-unfurled for the 17th time, now swollen and tearing at the creases. Napoleon, on the other hand, was already moving. He believed, firmly, if somewhat prematurely, that the Prussians had been defeated entirely, broken beyond repair. He assumed they were in retreat toward Prussia proper, rather than regrouping conveniently nearby at Wavre. He tasked Marshal Grouchy with the noble duty of chasing them down and ensuring they didn't interfere again. Grouchy took the assignment with the mild bewilderment of a man given a fishing net and told to catch fog. The roads were flooded, scouts unreliable, and no one was entirely sure where the Prussians had gone. Nonetheless, Grouchy marched, in the wrong direction, but with admirable conviction. Meanwhile, the Prussians, soaked and bruised but far from defeated, were already sending word to the Duke of Wellington. Wellington, somewhere near Brussels, was not having a restful day either. He had learned of Blucher's setback at Ligny and was rapidly calculating the odds of being left alone to face Napoleon. His army was a patchwork: British redcoats, Dutch-Belgian volunteers, German contingents, all spread across hills that would soon be famous for reasons no one yet suspected. Back at Napoleon's headquarters, decisions were made with the calm detachment of a man who believed his own press releases. He moved his main army westward toward Wellington, aiming to strike a decisive blow. He assumed the Prussians were out of the picture. He assumed Grouchy would do his job. He assumed a great many things. The French soldiers, for their part, sloshed onward. Supply carts creaked through puddles the size of canoes. Dragoons adjusted saddles that had gone soft in the rain. Infantrymen squinted into the horizon and wondered if they'd be allowed to dry their shirts before the next musket volley. No one dared ask whether this was all going to plan, mostly because no one was entirely sure what the plan was anymore. Messages flew between commanders on horseback, some soaked through before they could be read. Orders were copied by lantern light under canvas. Horses slipped on stone, boots leaked, tempers frayed, but only quietly. Farmhouses were requisitioned, barns repurposed, and fields stomped into shallow lakes. Somewhere along the way, a cannon sunk half its wheel into the mud and had to be pulled free with 6 horses and a questionable prayer. No one found this funny, though a few did laugh, perhaps from nerves. The Prussians, still very much alive, used the day to bandage wounds, realign their lines, and prepare to re-enter the story at just the right moment. They were not fast, but they were deliberate. They had not lost, they reminded themselves. They had merely repositioned, and they would prove it, just not today. So the day passed, slowly, quietly, as if the continent were holding its breath. In a tavern somewhere outside Waterloo, an officer wrote home describing the countryside as green, with a scent of thunder. He had no idea that by nightfall tomorrow the fields would be trampled into legend and his boots would be filled with history. But not yet. For now, sleep came in shifts, beneath makeshift tents and waterlogged coats. Horses snorted in their sleep, campfires flickered and hissed in the rain. Commanders reviewed plans by candlelight, drawing lines across maps that had never quite matched the terrain. This was the pause before the plunge, the inhale before the final shout. And as the night stretched on, history shuffled its pages and prepared the next chapter. By the early hours of June 18th, the armies had begun to arrive, quietly, clumsily, and quite soaked. They did not march so much as squelch their way forward, across churned-up cart paths and fields that looked more like soup than soil. Boots pulled half-heartedly free of the muck. Carts groaned under the weight of cannonballs and crates of hard biscuit. A few unlucky drummers carried drums that had absorbed so much water they no longer thudded. They simply sighed. Napoleon's army was assembling near a ridge known as Mont Saint-Jean. A gentle slope of land, unremarkable in most ways, except that it happened to sit between him and the coalition army under the Duke of Wellington. This ridge, modest in size, forgettable in shape, was about to become the most significant hill in Europe. Wellington, meanwhile, had set up his forces along the reverse side of that same ridge. He was a master of understatement and favoured the element of surprise, especially when it involved hiding an entire army behind a hill. His troops arrived in patches, like rain on a slate roof. British regulars in bright red coats, Dutch and Belgian infantry, German units from Hanover and Brunswick, none of them quite sure if they'd be marching or dying today. Behind them, field hospitals were being organised with grim efficiency. Tents were set, buckets were filled. Sawbones checked their tools and sighed the way men sigh before a long day of regrettable work. It was a strange moment, a silence not born of peace, but of too many people thinking at once. Soldiers stared into fog. Officers exchanged brief glances that meant, "I suppose this is it." The air had that strange smell of storm-drenched soil and gunpowder that hadn't been fired yet. Napoleon had risen early, though not as early as his sub-commanders might have liked. He was suffering from what later historians would call gastritis, and what his troops would simply call not a great omen. Still, he reviewed his formations, observed the field from a distance, and declared the enemy was precisely where he wanted them. Confidence, even when slightly gassy, was his trademark. The delay in beginning the battle was partly strategic. Napoleon wanted the ground to dry. His cannons, heavy beasts of bronze and ambition, would be ineffective if the soil remained soup-like. And so, despite the weight of fate pressing on every sodden tent and damp uniform, the battle didn't begin immediately. Instead, soldiers waited. Some napped where they stood, leaning against their bayonets. Others murmured to each other about bread, or boots, or the unfairness of life. Cavalrymen checked their saddles, then checked them again. Artillerymen cleaned gun barrels with quiet intensity. The fog lifted slowly, revealing the full stretch of the battlefield, a green theatre ready for history's least relaxing matinee. The French army was arranged with mathematical precision, infantry in columns, cavalry poised like arrows in a quiver, artillery spaced along the ridgelines. On paper, it was flawless. In practice, the ground was still mush and the men were tired. Across the field, Wellington's army had no such geometrical charm. His deployment was functional, tucked behind the slope to avoid unnecessary attention, but his troops were loyal, well-drilled, and had the singular advantage of fighting on their own terms. Wellington himself, observing from horseback beneath a wide-brimmed hat, looked like a man who had already anticipated the day's worst news and decided he could live with it. The roads behind both armies teemed with activity, messengers galloping back and forth, carts attempting three-point turns in fields, and surgeons preparing to be busy. And somewhere, not far, but not close enough, Marshal Grouchy was still chasing shadows. The Prussians were moving toward Waterloo, not away. They would arrive late, but not too late. But none of this was known just yet. This was the final inhale before history held its breath, an eerie calm, a moment of impossible balance, teetering on the edge of thunder. And so, the armies waited, surrounded by the kind of quiet that only comes before something very loud. At the centre of the battlefield, nestled modestly in a fold of the land, stood a small stone farmhouse, La Haie Sainte. Its name meant the Holy Hedge, which was a charming title for what amounted to a barn with dreams of self-importance. It wasn't large, wasn't heavily fortified, and certainly wasn't prepared to become the focal point of one of the most consequential battles in modern European history. And yet, it did. Because this is how history works. Sometimes you're a farmhouse, sometimes you're a metaphor, and sometimes you're just very, very in the way. Wellington's men had garrisoned La Haie Sainte early, placing troops from the King's German Legion, essentially Hanoverians with British uniforms and very little patience, within its walls. They had a few rifles, slightly more gunpowder than they needed, and an unspoken understanding that today was not going to be gentle. The farmhouse itself was surrounded by a low stone wall and a courtyard, giving it just enough defensive appeal to be tragically significant. There were narrow openings for shooting through and stout doors for holding shut, but there was no proper artillery, no heavy reinforcements, no exit plan. Napoleon, staring through his telescope from the far side of the battlefield, decided this little cluster of buildings needed to be taken, not because it was tactically essential, though it sort of was, but because it was there. And because once someone digs into a place, the natural response of every general in history is to try to pry them out of it. So the French sent in wave after wave. Infantry marched across open fields toward the compound. Cavalry attempted to circle around. Cannon fire shattered roof tiles and peppered the courtyard with deadly splinters. Smoke rose in lazy plumes as musket fire cracked in the air, one tired shot at a time. Inside, the defenders were short on ammunition, but long on stubbornness. The King's German Legion fought from behind crumbling walls and leaned out of broken windows, returning fire with slow, deliberate precision. The air within the farmhouse thickened with gun smoke and shouted orders. If someone had dropped a teacup, it would have shattered just to emphasize the mood. Throughout the day, the fighting seesawed. French soldiers gained the wall, were repelled, gained it again, fell back again. The field around the farmhouse began to resemble a painter's palette. Mud-brown, blood-red, and the grey-white haze of cannon mist. Horses refused to charge. Muskets misfired in the damp. A French officer reportedly tried to use a fence post as a battering ram. A British soldier reloaded with such slow determination it may have been personal. These are not the grand, sweeping moments of battlefield myth. These are the hours of attrition, the dragging middle of a fight that refuses to be theatrical. By mid-afternoon, the men in the farmhouse had nearly run out of ammunition. They held their ground anyway, resorting to bayonets, buttstocks, and the sheer collective will not to be moved. It wasn't gallantry so much as a deep unwillingness to let the French have the satisfaction. Eventually, the French would take La Haye-Sainte. They would crawl over its broken walls and push through smoke-choked doorways, only to find the defenders had already slipped away. It would be a hollow victory. By the time they captured it, it was no longer the keystone to the battle. It was just a burned, broken building full of bad memories. And the field moved on. Napoleon's men now had a position in the centre of the field, but they'd paid for it in blood, time, and morale. Wellington's line, though battered, held, and in the distance, always in the distance, there were rumours of movement, Prussian movement. But for now, all that could be heard was the distant boom of cannon fire, the groan of a wounded horse, and the creaking sigh of a barn door that had survived more than it should have. If you were standing atop the ridge with Wellington's forces that afternoon, and let's assume you had a sturdy pair of boots, a fondness for drizzle, and no pressing appointments, you might have seen something both impressive and deeply puzzling begin to unfold. Down below, in the rolling belly of the battlefield, the French cavalry began to move. And by move, we mean gallop, en masse. It started, as these things do, with a decision made at a distance. Marshal Ney, famously brave and questionably impulsive, observed what he believed to be a British retreat. To be fair, the field looked chaotic. Men repositioning, gaps forming in lines, supply carts reversing direction. But this was not a retreat. This was battlefield maintenance. Ney, however, saw an opportunity, and like any good commander with a moustache you could braid and an honour debt to settle, he seized it. He ordered a cavalry charge, then another, and then, seemingly because the field was open and the horses were ready, many more. Soon, thousands of cuirassiers, French heavy cavalry clad in gleaming breastplates, were thunderously making their way up the slope toward Wellington's centre. Behind them, dragoons, lancers, and every horseman in the general vicinity followed, because at a certain point, when everyone else is charging, you just don't want to be the one left behind polishing saddles. The ground trembled with the force of hooves. The sun, on the rare occasions it broke through the clouds, glinted off helmets and sabres. And up the hill they came, wave after wave, toward the waiting British lines. Except, those lines weren't running. They were forming squares, infantry squares, tight-knit human fortresses, bristling with bayonets on every side. A time-honoured method of repelling cavalry, perfected in theory and often less perfect in practice. But at Waterloo, the British squares held. As the French horses charged, they met not a broken line, but a wall of steel and flint-eyed soldiers prepared to poke anything that got too close. The horses veered. Riders wheeled away. Some broke through the outer layers, only to be surrounded. Some circled back and charged again, over and over, for hours. In the square, a British soldier might have stood ankle-deep in spent cartridges and mud, watching cavalry swirl like weather around him. There was little to do but wait, fire, reload, adjust hat. Try not to blink as another sabre flashed past your field of vision. From above, the battlefield must have looked like a great dance of confusion, circular sweeps of horses, stationary squares of red-coated humans, clouds of smoke pulsing with cannon fire. Marshal Ney, undeterred by the results, committed yet more cavalry. It became almost philosophical. If the first 8 charges didn't work, surely the 9th might, or the 10th, or perhaps charging in increasingly dramatic ways would eventually exhaust the British into submission. Spoiler, it didn't. And somewhere in the background, Napoleon began to wonder whether this enthusiastic misuse of cavalry was helping. It was hard to say. Ney had passion. He had courage. What he did not have was infantry support or a plan B. By the time the sun began its descent behind the Belgian hills, the cavalry charges had taken their toll, not on the British line, but on the French cavalry themselves. Horses lay exhausted or wounded across the field. Riders sat slumped in saddles, sabres dulled from overuse. And still, the British infantry stood, square after square, like stubborn furniture in the middle of a storm. It was a masterclass in both endurance and the futility of charging a problem that did not wish to be charged. But while the cavalry was making grand gestures on the hillside, something else was moving. From the east, through forests and over muddy tracks, came the long-awaited echo of approaching drums, Prussians, and this time they weren't rumours. As the sun sagged ever so slightly in the Belgian sky, though perhaps not fast enough for the liking of anyone on the battlefield, the mood on the French side of things began to fray like the hem of an overworn greatcoat. Napoleon had gambled on speed, on precision, and on one particularly vigorous afternoon of horse-based chaos. But now, despite all the cannonade, all the drum beating, and all of Ney's enthusiastic circular theatrics, the lines had not broken. And worse, the horizon to the east was beginning to twitch with movement. Small at first, like insects swarming just beyond the trees. Then larger. Boots, marching, bayonets catching the dusk light. Flags, black, white, and unfriendly. The Prussians had arrived. And not a moment too soon for Wellington, who was still very much engaged in the act of not losing. Now, to understand why the Prussian arrival mattered so much, you need only imagine that you are Napoleon, still damp from earlier weather, a touch bloated from lunch, watching your cavalry spiral fruitlessly up a hill, and someone informs you that an entirely fresh army is arriving on your flank, not across from you, where your men are pointed, to your side, where you are not pointed at all. Field Marshal Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, commander of the Prussian forces, was not a man particularly prone to subtlety. He was elderly, yes, battle-worn, fond of brandy and somewhat prone to visions involving ghosts and strategy being whispered to him by dead soldiers. But he was also absolutely determined to be here. And after recovering from a near-disastrous fall at the Battle of Ligny, where his horse had politely rolled over him, he had gathered his men and marched to Waterloo like a pensioner with a vengeance. The Prussians did not arrive in one neat column. This was not a parade. It was more like a determined spillage of soldiers, first through the woods at Plancenoit, then into the open fields along Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon, understandably, was less than thrilled. He dispatched reinforcements, young men from the Imperial Guard, the Old Guard, artillery, anyone nearby who could be trusted to delay an advancing tide of disciplined, ticked-off Prussians. What followed was not an immediate collapse, but a slow and grinding expansion of the battlefield. Fighting began to stretch eastward into villages and hedgerows where smoke hung in the air like damp laundry. The Prussians pressed forward, their arrival giving new spirit to Wellington's embattled men and considerable indigestion to Napoleon's. What had been a frontal contest became a three-dimensional mess, still technically winnable, but now involving math Napoleon hadn't counted on. By evening, the sound of battle stretched for miles. Musket volleys crackled, cannon boomed like distant thunder, and wounded men wandered in widening spirals, looking for someone with a bandage, a biscuit, or directions. Napoleon attempted a counterattack. He sent in the Imperial Guard, his elite troops, seasoned veterans in bearskin hats, the kind of men you deploy when things have reached capital letter status. But even they, famously unstoppable, met their match. The Guard advanced. They took fire. They wavered. And then, quietly, stunningly, they retreated. And with that, the spell broke. On the ridge, British infantry, many of whom had spent the day in sweaty, square-shaped purgatory, began to advance. In the east, the Prussians surged harder, pressing like rising water. In the centre, French morale flickered, and then failed. Napoleon's line began to dissolve, not all at once, but in clusters. Some units turned and ran. Others fired a last round and dropped their weapons. Horses bolted, cannons were abandoned. Officers shouted into the smoke, trying to conjure order from a battlefield that had decided it was done pretending to be manageable. And Napoleon, he watched, stone-faced, the dream collapsing. There would be no second miracle, no decisive sweep, no thunderous victory, just mud, loss, and the uncomfortable realization that this time, this one final time, he had been outmaneuvered by clocks, boots, and stubborn allies who refused to break on cue. But even as the chaos rose, the man himself slipped away, folding into the night like a general-shaped footnote, galloping back toward the stories that would be told long after the cannon fell silent. And that, though the story sprawls onward, is where Waterloo, and indeed Napoleon's star, began its slow and irreversible descent. Of course, no one told the soldiers this at the time. Most of them were too busy trying to find a warm ditch, a dry biscuit, or an explanation for why they were still standing. The end of a battle is not marked by trumpets or a curtain call. It is quieter than that. At Waterloo, the echoes of cannon fire eventually gave way to the metallic clinks of bent muskets being gathered, the low moans of wounded men whose courage had outlasted their legs, and the soft crunch of bootsteps wandering across a field, no longer choosing sides. The fighting had stopped, yes, but the noise hadn't ended. It had only changed key. In the dimming light of June 18th, the battlefield of Waterloo was transformed from a map of strategic ambitions into something much simpler. A wide and soggy plain of mud, broken carts, fallen banners, and more human detritus than could be counted without a month and a strong stomach. And everywhere, hats, thousands of them, tossed, trampled, or just gently resting beside the heads of their former wearers. A veritable haberdasher's nightmare if the haberdasher in question had been dropped from a very great height onto a very ungracious battlefield. And still, no fanfare, no resolution, no curtain drop, only smoke, still rising in lazy loops from abandoned muskets and cannon mouths, and a damp breeze that couldn't quite decide if it wanted to carry the smell of gunpowder or manure. Survivors moved like slow ghosts, some in dazed silence, others dragging the less lucky by coat sleeves, hoping for medics that weren't coming, or for miracles that had already been spent on lesser things. For Wellington's men, those who still stood, upright and accounted for, the word victory had not yet been issued. It was more of a hunch. The French were no longer firing, the horizon no longer glittered with sabres, but no one quite dared say it aloud, because saying it might make it untrue. And anyway, the moment felt too wet for triumph. The Prussians, now fanning out in cautious, careful formations, were too practical to celebrate. They did not need parades. They needed to count boots, secure roads, and figure out who had the maps. Meanwhile, Napoleon was gone, or rather, leaving, which was very different. In the hours following the collapse, he did what any recently defeated emperor might. He mounted a horse, avoided eye contact, and began a long, unsatisfying ride back toward France, his uniform mud-smeared, his dreams rapidly depreciating in emotional value. Back on the field, the real work began, not of war, but of sorting. Bodies needed to be buried, quickly, before heat and rot and scavengers arrived. Weapons had to be collected, both for utility and to ensure no one changed their mind and resumed hostilities. Wounded soldiers were piled into makeshift field hospitals, barns, abandoned wagons, and in some cases, very patient cowsheds. There were not enough bandages, not enough surgeons, and absolutely no anesthetic. Just clumsy saws, vinegar-soaked cloth, and a lot of well-intentioned shouting. The locals, Belgian farmers who had spent the day wondering if the battle would ever politely relocate itself away from their potato fields, returned cautiously to inspect their homes, their fences, and, inevitably, their basements, where soldiers from both sides had taken up temporary residence and left behind odd souvenirs. Canteens, boots, a harmonica, perhaps an entire French dragoon asleep in a pantry. What had been a theatre of nations now became a very large, very grim clean-up site. One French officer later remarked that Waterloo had not felt like a battle. It had felt like a prolonged argument between artillery and geography, with men caught in the middle. Another British private, less eloquently, would describe it simply as a miserable, loud day, which, to be fair, was accurate. And still the rain threatened. By nightfall, the stars peeked down at a world changed. Napoleon was no longer invincible. The myth had been punctured. Europe would never be the same, not because of the strategy or the politics, but because this many people had shown up to settle one man's unfinished business and had left with an entirely new set of traumas, trench rot, and unpaid debts. But the war was over, even if the consequences weren't. And so, with that, we begin to wander toward the next stage of the story, not one of glory, but of awkward, limping diplomacy, of generals writing reports with suspicious optimism, of maps being redrawn in candlelit halls by men who hadn't fired a musket but had plenty of ink and even more opinions. And maybe, just maybe, we pause for a moment to reflect on how strange it is that such loud, catastrophic days so often end with quiet footsteps and a sky full of stars that seem not to notice nor care. Napoleon Bonaparte, once emperor of everything he could point at, was now an emperor of nothing more than his own thoughts, and even those were beginning to turn against him. The days following Waterloo did not carry the momentum of retreat. They carried the inertia of defeat. Quiet, sticky, reluctant defeat. Not the kind that storms gates or burns cities, but the sort that lingers in muddy boots, soggy dispatches, and letters hastily composed on the back of broken morale. Having narrowly escaped the battlefield, and, perhaps more significantly, his own entourage's disillusionment, Napoleon made his way back toward Paris, but not with the urgency of a man expecting to reclaim power. No, he returned, like a man trying to find misplaced keys in a house that's already been sold. France, as it turned out, was no longer in the mood for Bonaparte. Once, crowds had cheered his return from Elba with the enthusiasm usually reserved for a travelling magician or a tax holiday. Now, there was only the sound of official shoes tapping nervously across government floors, followed by the faint scratching of men drafting resignation letters before Napoleon could even finish his second espresso. The Chamber of Deputies, France's version of a political conscience, greeted his return not with open arms, but with open suspicion. There would be no round two, no dramatic reversal, no crowd-surfing triumph on the shoulders of a grateful republic. Instead, there were meetings, endless, exhausting meetings. Meetings about how to manage the situation. Meetings in which the word abdication was not so much whispered as delicately embroidered onto every chair cushion. By June 22nd, Napoleon gave in. Again. He abdicated the throne in favor of his son, an 1815 toddler with an unconvincing resume, and quietly surrendered the illusion that the empire could be saved by willpower, cavalry, and a really good tailcoat. His friends, or what remained of them, suggested he flee to America. A new world, a fresh start, fewer coalitions, more open land, and perhaps, for the first time in years, a chance at peace. But the British had other plans. Rather than allow their old nemesis to disappear into the fog and resurface later with an entirely new battle plan involving cornfields and erratic spelling, they intercepted his ship. Thus began Exile, the sequel. If Elba was a genteel form of retirement, St. Helena was the afterlife's poorly lit waiting room. Located in the South Atlantic and known primarily for being inconveniently placed, St. Helena was roughly the size of an enthusiastic postage stamp. It had no court, no admirers, no room for error, and a weather forecast that could best be described as persistent drizzle and philosophical doubt. Napoleon arrived with a small entourage and a large collection of unresolved feelings. His home for the next 6 years would be Longwood House, an estate so uncomfortable that even the wallpaper seemed to disagree with him. The wind moaned through the rafters and the furniture sulked. Everything creaked, nothing inspired. He passed the time not with grand strategies or stirring speeches, but with walks around the garden, petty squabbles with his British captors over wine rations, and dictating memoirs to the few who still believed in his legend, or at least found it profitable to record. In these slow, grey days, the once indomitable general became a man of memories, looping through campaigns, victories, losses, and theories that might have saved it all, if only. His health began to slip. Or perhaps it simply matched the mood of the place, drawn out, weary, and a little damp. By 1821, he was gone. Officially, the cause was stomach cancer. Unofficially, it might have been the island, or the weight of remembering too much for too long. He was buried on St. Helena, beneath a stone that said nothing of his rank or title, just his name. Years later, his remains were returned to France, reburied beneath the grand dome of Les Invalides, surrounded by marble and military reverence, as if to retroactively fix what had been quietly, soggily broken in exile. And yet, his story had not truly ended, because empires do not disappear. They echo, in maps redrawn, in books rewritten, in little boys playing soldier with wooden swords, dreaming of horses and glory and not quite understanding the paperwork that comes after battle. Next, perhaps we wander into that echo, the long and drowsy legacy of Napoleon, not in battles, but in culture, in bureaucracy, in coats with too many buttons. Or maybe we drift further still, into the cautious Europe he left behind, a continent that had to figure out peace after becoming addicted to war. But first, breathe in. The smoke is gone, the horses are at rest, and the man in the bicorn hat has finally stopped moving. Sleep now. There's more history to forget tomorrow.